Thank you, Lolita. Thank you, Sean and Rachel and everyone who organises the lecture series and giving me the chance to speak this afternoon. Yeah, you see, this is the thing with titles. I probably spend a bit too much time on those titles, and then and so that's what happened 2 or 3 months ago when I was asked to come up with one for this talk. I was at that time immersed in this data that I collected last summer around this movement called the Deaf People's Association in eastern Uttar Pradesh, which, as Lolita was saying, is headed by a man called Lal Bihari, who was about 15 years ago. He was trying to start a small business, and he went to try and get a loan from the bank, and the bank said, you need some collateral, and he said, well, I inherited some land from my father. So he had to go to the local land registry office, and when he got there and said, can I have a certificate to show this, they opened the books and said, well, according to our records, you actually are deceased. And he discovered that his uncle, his father's brother, had bribed a local official to register him as dead, so that his own sons would inherit this land. And so he began this long legal struggle to try and have himself formally recognised as alive, which he very much is. I've spoken to him and everything. And on that journey, which, as you can imagine, went through a maze of local government bureaucracies, he encountered lots more people, and there's now thousands of people basically who've been connected to this movement just in eastern UP alone, who are, technically speaking, not alive to the state, and who are trying to have themselves instated as living citizens. And so I was reading about this material, which again this is one of those things where I do have a tendency to get distracted by. I just found this story. I was in UP last summer and came across this. Where I was reading the newspaper with this guy, Satendra Kumar, who's working as a research assistant, and we were just like, let's get on a train and go and speak to these people. That sounds fascinating. So I was reading all this stuff on the state and biopolitics and civil society, and came up with my title, and then alas, other things got in the way, so I couldn't finish it. But I will absolutely next year, if there is an opening on the schedule, come back and tell you all about that and what to make of it. So the work that instead I'm going to talk about today is stuff that I've been doing since 2010, and the first thing I want to point to is that it's very much a collaboration with Craig Jeffrey, who's a professor of geography at the University of Oxford, and with Satendra Kumar, who is now in the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics. And they've been involved in all parts of this and are very much present in the material that I'm presenting today. And it's a presentation that draws mostly from these two articles, one of which came out in EPW at the end of last year, Making Ends Meet, Youth Enterprise at the Intersections. And then most recently a piece, and this is part of why the other talk didn't get finished, because me and Craig were revising and resubmitting this piece to the Annals of American Geography on improvising India. So that's the kind of material that I'm drawing on here. And in many ways it is a continuation of this earlier work on microfinance that I did for my dissertation, in the sense that my key sort of themes in my research are thinking about processes of economic liberalization, market formation, and particularly in relation to smaller, more provincial cities, smaller in the Indian context, i.e. just 1 million or so. Because I think that with the so-called urban turn in the late 1990s in South Asia research, there's a lot of work that's come out in terms of Bangalore and Chennai and Delhi, and these mega cities. I think there's lots of really interesting things happening in those small and medium-sized cities in India. I think you could say the same for China as well, in fact, that is being sort of missed out, and that there are sort of rich grounds for being able to understand some of these processes of economic change. And then the second part is that in terms of these continuities is that I am interested in questions around youth and in particular young men and masculinities, and the kinds of enterprises that this new sort of generation that has emerged in India post following the extension of these liberal reforms in the 1990s, what kinds of new economic activities that they're involved in. And the story today really begins at this place. This is one of a couple of tea stalls on the fringes of Chaudhry Charan Singh University in Meerut in northwest UP, where I spent a lot of time last summer, and also some time in 2010 when I was there with Craig, which is nice because I do like consuming tea in vast quantities. But the main reason why I was there is because every morning a group of young men would congregate at the tea stall, and they would huddle together on these old wooden benches and on broken plastic chairs, and they would map out ways to make money in the city. And this included things such as extorting money from local private college owners, acting as brokers between local contractors who were trying to get contracts with university administrators, and also charging fees from younger students in the area who wanted help in terms of getting admittance to college or a dormitory, or in terms of being able to access their degree certificates or exam results, these kinds of things. And what was interesting, and the main point that I'm going to reflect on today, was the way in which those young men then reflected on the kinds of activities that they're involved in, not as examples of corruption or criminal activity, but as examples of jugaad, which is an old North Indian word which, and we'll get into the complexity of this in a moment, but roughly translated would mean shrewd improvisation with the resources at hand. So this is that's a sort of key term in the presentation today, and the main argument that I want to make from that is that ideas around enterprise and entrepreneurship aren't just transmitted sort of top down from a few powerful locales and a few key institutions like the World Bank or governments, and transmitted top down to relatively marginalized populations. Instead, what we need to do is think about how enterprise cultures are produced in a variety of locales around the world. And what I want to think about is the ways in which those indigenous, those scare quotes around that for the recording, cultures of enterprise meld together and may help to extend and deepen processes of neoliberalization. So, just to give a bit of theoretical background, there's obviously a longer history of work on informal enterprise. It's been a theme in research in the Global South for a long time. One can think of earlier work by Keith Hart, where this whole term informal economies come from, when he was talking about migrants in the city of Accra, in informal settlements and the small businesses that they were setting up in his paper from 1973. And the work of Thomas Belmonte, who did work in Naples in the 1970s, in which he described the aggression and everyday guile of the poor Neapolitan man who, he wrote, is capable of monopolizing and wielding physical force, adept at subtle psychological manipulations and clever deceptions, tough, wise, and not good at losing. And so there's a sort of that historical backdrop in terms of that research that I'm interested in. But I think there's a new wave of research that's come out more recently on these forms of informal enterprise that are thinking about this in relation to neoliberal reforms in various parts of the world. And by neoliberalism, what I mean is basically a sort of a project that sees the market as the best way to deliver and distribute resources and social goods, and is therefore in favor of limited government intervention in terms of managing markets. And so these kinds of transformations have, of course, been very marked in India. India's approach to macroeconomic planning pre-1985 combined a leading role for the private sector in economic decision-making alongside state interventions that aim to address social and spatial inequalities through widespread development efforts. In the face of a fiscal crisis, however, the Indian state began a program of economic liberalization, which then intensified in the early 1990s. And this drive included the removal of many tariffs and export licenses, deregulation of the banking sector, and the gradual lowering of barriers to foreign direct investments. And these kinds of economic shifts in India, as elsewhere, have been linked to a now fairly well-known ideological program whereby the government and other institutions like the World Bank try to generate consent for these reforms by inciting people to think of themselves as entrepreneurs and to engage more deeply with the markets as a way for them to improve their economic standing. And what's happened, and there's plenty of research now to sort of point to these trends, is that in many places what we've seen is growing economic inequalities tied to these reforms, and also in many places a deterioration in terms of the quality and quantity of paid work, which has pushed more people into the informal sector, which is what I think is interesting in terms of reflecting back on this work in the 1970s with poorer populations. I think now there are different kinds of actors also who are engaged in similar kinds of forms of enterprise. Now, one of the things that is interesting to me as someone who studies neoliberalism is the ways in which there's a sort of polarized debate or polarization in terms of the kinds of work that is coming out around neoliberalism. So there's a lot of work that says, here we found some examples of people who are resisting these kinds of trends and these processes and forming social movements and environmental movements and engaging in all kinds of urban protest and these kinds of things. Okay, so there's that sort of work. And then there's another set of work that is thinking more in terms of how neoliberalism has actually been quite successful in terms of inculcating in people this spirit of enterprise and to see themselves as enterprising subjects who should be more market oriented. So there's those two kinds of sets of work. I want to point to a different possibility by focusing neither on resistance nor on straightforward absorption and reproduction of neoliberal ideas, but rather to creative reproduction and extension of notions of enterprise. And to make this point, I'm going to draw on the work of Pierre Bourdieu and his notion of habitus. By habitus, Bourdieu is referring to those durable, transposable dispositions that reside deep within us, almost hardwired to our brains, and which reflect our social positions in terms of class, gender, caste, and so on. They unconsciously shape our everyday practices, our tastes, expectations, the way we walk and talk and dress, comport ourselves, in ways which we then come to see as natural. Yet, and this is an important point for me, Bourdieu stresses that habitus should not be understood as a fixed set of behaviors that people simply mechanically enact. So moving away from that idea of, there's this cultural capital that simply gets passed down to another generation. Rather, Bourdieu says, habitus can be thought of as a generative mechanism. Just as social economic structures, or the field, as Bourdieu talks about it, begin to change, so do the practices through which social groups maintain their privilege. People do not passively imbibe and reproduce dominant ideas, they inventively reproduce their social position. And I'm going to argue that jugaad among young men in Meerut is a striking example of the kinds of arguments that Bourdieu is making. So, let me give some background on the site where I've been doing this work with Craig and Satendra. So Meerut is a city of some 1 million people in northwest UP, which is, as many of you will know, India's most populous state and one that ranks near the bottom of just about every national development indices. Meerut is an ancient city that emerged as a commercial and administrative hub in the 19th century. Since it was then famous as a sort of industrial hub for producing also musical instruments for sports equipment. But more recently, there's been a waning in terms of the industrial base, and there hasn't been this expansion of sort of IT or software industries in this particular region, even though it's only about 80 kilometers from Delhi. The one area where there has been growth is in terms partly of private healthcare, but also particularly in terms of the expansion of private secondary schools and colleges. If you travel along, as I have done a few times, the bypass from Delhi to Meerut, it's impossible not to be struck by the large number of billboards and painted walls advertising courses for B.Eds, B.Techs, LLBs, MBAs. And as you reach the peripheries of Meerut, there are dozens of new colleges dotted among the mango orchards and sugarcane fields, many of them with large tinted windows and grand entrances. So you can see some of these were taken in the back of a taxi by an increasingly irate driver getting told to sort of, wait a second, I need a picture of that one as well, kind of thing, on one of these journeys. But it gives you a sense of, and these are some of the colleges as well, as you can see with this. They always have this sort of rather splendid facade on the outside as well. So these are all on the sort of peripheries of the city of Meerut. So this expansion in terms of private education can be linked to a series of political, economic, demographic shifts. In part, it could be explained by thinking through the growth of a large youth population in this area. So in 2001, there were nearly 50% more young men in the category of 15 to 29 than in the category 30 to 44. It's also, though, linked to changing aspirations and power dynamics in the regions. So in the 1980s, households belonging to middle class began to invest more heavily in the education of their children, and in particular their sons. Most prominently, wealthy Jat farmers in the area, many of whom had benefited from the Green Revolution, saw higher education as providing their sons with a path into well-paid government jobs and further consolidating their grip over local state resources. More recently, though, the rise of the BSP, which was established in 1984 to promote the cause of Dalits, helped to further boost enrollment in higher education. The BSP was part of a power-sharing coalition at the state level in UP 4 times between 1993 and 2003, and actually ruled on its own in the state between 2007 and 2012. And on each occasion, it's introduced a series of new scholarships and incentives aimed at increasing the number of low-caste students who are actually enrolled in college courses. What's important to note, though, is that just as the enrollment was increasing in college courses, so there was also a decline in terms of per capita expenditure, in terms of per student expenditure in the public sector education. The provision of quality of teaching aids and equipment and catering facilities is pretty poor in many public sector colleges and universities, and in the new private colleges that I just showed you some of that have emerged over the last few years since that sector was opened up by the government in the late 1990s. There's similar problems in terms of the quality of education, and those colleges have quickly earned a reputation for pretty ruthless profiteering from their students. So in short, there was a chasm that opened up in UP between a narrow strata of elite colleges providing good quality education, and then this mass of poorer, resourced and funded colleges catering to the majority of the population. And paralleling this decline in educational standards, there's also been a diminution in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of highly prized government jobs. In 2002, the UP government agreed, under some pressure from the World Bank, to address its fiscal issues by committing to cutting government jobs by 2% a year in order to receive continued financial assistance from the World Bank. So there's been a reduction in those kinds of public sector jobs, and there's also been very little, as I say, in terms of growth of IT and private sector development in that sector. So taken together, these political, economic, demographic shifts work to produce a cohort of frustrated young men who felt as though their path into successful adulthood, the kinds of jobs that they've been groomed to expect, this idea of achieving financial independence, of getting married and so on, had effectively been blocked. I want to note that some women who attended colleges were able to take up positions as teachers in government schools, but social norms meant that many young men saw that as low status, low quality work, and weren't interested in pursuing that particular path. So they frequently voiced their concerns about their lack of opportunities to convert these qualifications into the kinds of jobs that they wanted. They were also, though, reluctant to return to rural areas, engage in agricultural labour, and in many cases just stayed in Meerut, stayed enrolled in courses. This is where you meet people who are on their second PhD and stayed around the area and hoped that the circumstances would change and improve. The extent to which they could do this, of course, depended on their financial resources, whether they were getting support from their family and their sort of social connections. But everyone was aware that you can't simply just wait forever. So the question then became, how do young men in this situation try to move forward and try to move forward in terms of their social economic situation? So one of the things that emerged out of earlier work, and this is earlier work that Craig was conducting in 2005, was that he noted that the emergence of a group of young Jat men who were becoming very active in terms of student politics on the campuses at Chowdhury Singh University and also at a few other colleges affiliated to that university. Kissenpal was typical of this. He was 24 at the time, had been studying science subjects for 5 years. Tall, well-built and confident, he came from a relatively wealthy Jat family, but had failed to obtain salaried work. The moment I heard I was not going to get government work, he said, I decided upon a different line. I dedicated myself to serving the youth of the nation. He stage managed student protests. He organized students to rally against lack of funding or university administrators' corruption or harassment of students, and sometimes drew quite large crowds to these rallies. And on occasions was able to actually win concessions from the university, and having cultivated this sort of reputation on campus as someone who could get political work done for the students, he succeeded in obtaining a post in the student union. What was interesting is that once he had acquired this post, he began to change in terms of the kind of politics that he was involved in. He sped around on a motorcycle between rural political meetings, government offices, and parties in local hotels. And after 5 months, he'd been able to purchase a Meerut car, after 10 months, a Tata Indica. He made money by acting as a broker between private contractors seeking to construct university buildings and the university administration, and also took money from students in return for helping fix hostel rooms and entrance papers. So a small but nevertheless significant group of young men had responding to this dispiriting political economic situation in a similar way. They tried to develop themselves as key figures on the university campus. But once they got a post in the student union, or even if they didn't, but had sort of built their reputation, they directed their attention away from collective demonstrations on issues such as corruption, lack of public investment, and towards accruing personal incomes, acting as intermediaries. This phenomenon of youth politicos selling out, as it were, is obviously not new. But what's particularly noteworthy, I want to argue, is the way that they reflected on this transition. Sometimes young men talked about this in relation to this as forms of business and enterprise, and used those words. And this suggests that in part they were influenced by neoliberal discourses that were circulating through the city at that time. There were lots of advertising hoardings telling people to get ahead, join a new generation of entrepreneurs, move to Delhi. There were personality centers, cropping up where people would, you could go and be trained in the forms of, how to conduct yourself in an interview and how to make it in the city and this kind of thing. And so part of that, I want to argue, it was reflected in terms of their social strategies. But more commonly, they refer to their actions with reference to this word jugaad. And jugaad is a complicated word in the sense that it can be a verb or a noun, and people sometimes use it in very, very different ways. Broadly, it means shrewd improvisation with materials at hand, and it connotes flexibility, inventiveness, pragmatism, and guile. One of the classic images of jugaad is of a truck that's been cobbled together from spare parts, scrap metal, and bits of wood, which is something you see often in rural North India. And the word sometimes carries more specific sense of combining materials that come from two quite different spheres, or sort of rural and urban materials in that sense. Because jugaad can also mean finding a way around, it's also used euphemistically to describe instances in which people bribe officials or use influence to acquire a public good. Jugaad is therefore a morally loaded word, connoting in some instances positive traits, thrift, quick thinking, inventiveness, and in other circumstances suggesting negative ones, a lack of principles, shoddiness, and a predilection for shortcuts. Jugaad became a key theme in the research when myself and Craig were doing more work in 2010 in Meerut. And by this time, and this is just an estimate, but around 10% of the young male Jat students that we were doing interviews with were now involved in this kind of work as brokers or fixers in the manner of Kisampala I described earlier. And they talked about their work in the same way. And there's some important ideas that I want to bring out about what this word, how we might reflect on this in terms of what it means in terms of economic change in India today. The first is to note that the cultural practices associated with jugaad reflected social inequalities. So Jats were able to establish themselves as brokers in large part because they had some financial backing from their parents and a set of social connections in local bureaucracies that they'd inherited from Senior Kim. Students who came from wealthy backgrounds had a type of swagger, or what Bourdieu might call a feel for the game, that other students, particularly those from lower castes, found it hard to emulate. And this kind of bravado was really important in terms of establishing yourself as someone who could act as a broker. At the same time, Jat politicos sometimes drew a contrast between their inventive efforts to seek money, and they would contrast that with the sort of what they saw as lazy upper caste students in Delhi who, because they were privileged, didn't need to cultivate those skills. So they saw it very much as reflecting their social position as these sort of lower middle class men who had to engage in these forms of hustle. Moreover, the capacity of Jat politicos to make money was also a function of their gender. Women were not expected to be in certain public spaces, including tea stalls, for example, spend a long time there. And Jat figures also associated jugaad with locally hegemonic visions of successful masculinity, of physical strength, of sexual prowess, of equanimity in the face of danger. So they would note that women could do some forms of jugaad in terms of improvising with household budgets or mending things in the home. But they argue that the kind of sort of more aggressive, strong-arm jugaad that they were engaged in as ambitious young politicos was beyond the scope of younger women. And this reflects also some of the earlier themes, again, in the work that I did on microfinance in terms of thinking around the gendering of different forms of enterprise as well. In that case, how it was linked to forms of different forms of mobilities, and then ideas around what kinds of entrepreneurship are seen as appropriate for men and women. A second point is that jugaad was often thought of as a quality of young people. So they would often talk about how their senior kin had established good social contacts with police officers or people working in bureaucracies, but argued that they didn't have the audacity to really turn an unpromising situation into an opportunity. And sometimes they would talk about having to, when they go back to villages, give their older relatives sort of lessons in how to really sort of exploit some of these situations. And there were also spatial dimensions to jugaad. Jat young men stressed the importance of being able to move between different settings, in particular between the rural and the urban. This required skills of social navigation that they had cultivated through growing up in villages and then continuing their education in cities. It's possible, then, I would argue, that that's why we might see places like Meerut and other kinds of smaller, more provincial towns as places where we do see these really interesting entrepreneurial cultures emerging, precisely because of these intersections between the rural and urban in those places. And the ways in which this kind of culture of enterprise depends on that idea of being able to navigate between those spaces. And at a more micro-geographical scale, they also emphasize the importance of having this really fine-grained understanding of the local state and of different bureaucracies, of how they worked and of how to play them off one another. And then finally, and this of course is a really key point, is that jugaad was a useful sort of discourse amongst Jat politicos because it was a way to euphemize their involvement in activities that might otherwise have been referred to as corruption, and were referred to as corruption by other people. There were many students on campus, of course, who were not persuaded by this term, and who were extremely frustrated and voiced their discontent at the kinds of activities that these former so-called champions of student causes were now involved in, and saw this as a kind of betrayal of students. But Jat politicos often responded by making a moral distinction between jugaad, instances where they've made money by relying on their own ingenuity in that particular moment, and more nefarious forms of corruption or extortion, where government officials were just making money for more and more money off the backs of other students and poorer populations. So this culture of jugaad, I would argue, served to reproduce social economic inequalities within Meerut. And going back though to in the sense of their own advantage vis-a-vis poorer students and also young women. But going back to Bourdieu, I want to suggest that this wasn't a straightforward process. It involved new kinds of practices. And in response to a shifting economic situation, particularly this tightening of government jobs for people with degrees, they were now, I would argue, these young men deepening and accelerating dominant caste entrepreneurialism in response to that. So, in the summer of 2012, Craig separately, and then also myself and Satendra, were doing more work on this topic and looking at the expansion of private colleges around Meerut. And a few Jat politicos that have been part of previous research in 2010 and in Craig's work in 2005 were now more closely affiliated with political parties, working as agitators and intermediaries. Others were said to be no longer involved in the game. Still others had run into problems with the law and fled the city or landed up in prison. But remarkably, 12 of around 20 Jat politicos that had been involved in the research at earlier stages and had emerged as student leaders in 2005 were now prominent players in Meerut's flourishing private college sector. They'd accumulated sufficient money from their politicking to be able to invest in a plot of land and pay for building materials. They also utilized their bureaucratic links and close understanding of administrative procedures to obtain the required permissions and accreditation from the state. Some of them now owned multiple colleges and were reaping huge profits, charging students bogus fees, underpaying staff and skimping on resources, all things that they had originally riled against as student leaders when they were opposed to these things, were now just some of the ways that they generated illicit revenues. And having gained a more secure foothold in the sector, many of them were keen to jettison these references to God. So you can see this from one example of a former student leader who now owns a couple of colleges, saying, when I asked him about whether this term was important in terms of his own practices, he said, no, to open a college you need to build social relationships. This is hard work. You're helping people, giving them an education. Even after I'm dead, this will still be remembered. So you cannot say that this is God. And likewise, this profiteering, others I should say as well, were also keen in terms of their colleges to hire sort of respected retired civil servants to sort of be the public face of their college as well in this effort to sort of disassociate themselves from those kinds of practices. This profiteering of a new class of college owners continued to provoke disdain among many young people who complained that they'd made their fortune by exploiting other students. Suresh, a young Dalit man who'd been in college for close to a decade, expressed his dismay at how Jat entrepreneurs continued to trick others into believing they were honest businessmen, merely trying to provide education for the rural poor. The problem is that India's society is very gullible, he told us. People see them and think, yesterday this guy was wearing sandals, today he has an expensive car, so they're all attracted to this. Now, in spite of the fact that there was some degree of self-reinvention going on amongst this now older generation of youth entrepreneurs, the kinds of jugaad speak that had emerged a few years earlier were even more intense by 2012, and there's two components to that. One of which is that other Jat students came to campus, saw what had happened, and as this student is suggesting here, thought, I want to emulate, those people, and were, even though there've been various scandals and scams exposed in the media, they were still convinced that you can still find the loopholes and make money out of this. But also what we found was that the rise of Dalits who are also engaged in jugaad. So earlier there'd been a group of Dalit politicos on campus who sought to actually expose the corrupt dealings of Jat politicos and built alliances with sympathetic officials in government offices. And Dalit politicking at that time acted as something of a check on Jat power. They were occasionally able to intervene if a Dalit student had been harmed in order to obtain justice. Yet by 2012, most Dalit interlocutors had abandoned such work. Many were acting as paid intermediaries between students and university administrations, working as muscle men or hired lobbyists for building contractors, and colluding with higher caste business people in the expansion and commercialization of private education in Meerut and its immediate hinterland. And it was not only about repressing student protests. By 2012, most colleges were looking to expand the suite of courses that they were offering. That's why I was saying, in terms of, degrees in fashion design and MBAs and these kinds of things, beyond just a Bachelor of Education, which had been the sort of main part of the initial expansion. And they had trouble selling those seats in those programs, right? Because it was quite difficult to recruit enough people to say, you really need a master's in fashion design. This will unlock all kinds of opportunities. So what many of these young men were doing was buying seats in these private colleges at a bulk rate where they got a discount, and then they would go off to villages where they were able to sort of coax parents by inflating the social value of these credentials into paying what for them was a lot of money to send their children into these courses. And another thing that surfaced in 2012 was how also the BSP was giving various scholarships for low caste students where they were supposed to be covering their tuition fees, so it would basically be free for them. And there were a group of brokers, a couple of whom we almost got to interview, who were involved in going around villages around Meerut, collecting the personal information and details from Dalit households, selling that to the college, who then registered those students in their programs, collected the money that was supposed to have been allocated for them, and then I was told, even if those people actually did show up for course, still charged them anyway for attending that. So in the paper, what we argue is Jap Political's improvisation partly provided Dalits with a set of practical strategies and discursive tropes through which they could accumulate resources and also justify those actions. But there were other forces at work too. Dalit involvement in brokerage was facilitated to some extent by the rise of the BSP, which won a victory, of course, in 2007 in the state elections. And some Dalits said that they'd entered brokerage work after seeing the BSP leader, Mayavati, becoming involved in corruption. And certainly the argument could be made that Mayavati did much during her term in office to reinforce a notion that Dalits should be doing whatever they need to do to be able to move ahead. A second component of this intensification in terms of talk around Jugaad, though, and a little more curious, is the fact that by 2012 it was also a term that had been picked up and was circulating in national level media in India and also in planning circles. And this is where you might have some of you, if you've encountered it, and there's various kinds of things that are coming out around this today, and if you search on the web, there's lots of things around this. So this bubbling up of Jugaad in national debate can be traced in part to the Commonwealth Games, where initially, I remember being there in 2010, just before the Commonwealth Games started, and initially there was this concern around, oh my God, it's not gonna work, it's gonna be a disaster. And then, before it started, there was the weightlifting room and the ceiling fell in or something like this, and the corruption and mismanagement is gonna scupper the Commonwealth Games. But eventually it passed off and it went okay. And so then there was this thing of, well, how did they do it? And this is where you saw various kinds of journalists and commentators saying, well, it's because of Indian Jugaad, this ability to, even when it doesn't look like you've got the resources, somehow fix things up and make it work. So a lot of journalists and planners began to pen their own tributes to this sort of practical savoir-faire of Indians. And there was a common argument that emerged at this time that, well, China can manufacture at lower costs, but Indians have this critical capacity to innovate around a budget and maneuver past constraints. That's a quote from one journalist. And the words of one seasoned advisor in India, the country now needs 1 million Jugaads to address problems of housing, infrastructure, and services. There's now a National Innovation Council in India, which is partly devoted to encouraging Jugaad-like practices. And references to frugal innovation and frugal manufacturing are also sprinkled throughout the recently published draft of the 5-year plan. Now, I'm not proposing that the discourses of Jugaad that were emerging amongst young men in Meerut were influencing the centres of power in Delhi. And what's also important, though, is that clearly the terms being used here to connote Jugaad in its positive sense, in terms of this sort of spirited opportunism and this, capacity to be able to, still get things done even though, economic constraints are considerable. But I think it is possible that this kind of Jugaad culture was acting in a sort of mutually reinforcing way in terms of legitimizing the kinds of ideas and discourses produced amongst young men in Meerut, and also helping to sort of propel this drive amongst planners and policymakers in Delhi. What our research on local level illegal brokerage in Western UP suggests, though, is that we need to be critical in evaluating this new wave of Jugaad speak in India. Certainly, this kind of celebration of Jugaad in many ways could be seen as positive, in the sense that it's getting away from this older idea of the poor and the culture of poverty and these ideas and instead moving towards this sort of celebration of the sort of embodied knowledges and capacities of poor people. And there's people who are working on things around, new kinds of recycling industries and so on that would point to that as being exactly, we should be drawing attention to this. But there are I would argue, also problems with the government of India's embrace of Jugaad viewed against the backdrop of this ethnographic work in Meerut. For one, by proposing that individual enterprise should be the basis for progress, planners risk downplaying the importance of class, caste, and gender inequalities in the reproduction of poverty. And rather than seeing it as important as the state being able to tackle those problems, the idea being you just need to provide an enabling environment through which poor people can find their own creative solutions to problems of poverty and lack of resources. And another problem I would say is that this embrace of Jugaad could provide a means for elites in India who are already engaged in numerous forms of illegal activity and land grabbing and so on to justify their actions as well. So like Jack Politicos, with whom we talked, elites in India might be quick to point out that their strategies, whilst illegal, are in line with a kind of noble Indian principle of Jugaad. So let me just close with a few conclusions, just so we've got some time for some questions. So, in terms of telling this story, whereby you have the emergence of this class of richer farmers, they're educating their sons who can't get jobs, but who then use their social position to become brokers and see themselves as these arch improvisers, drawing on this idea of Jugaad. I think there's various kinds of points that can be developed from that. One of which is, I would say, is the importance of studying different kinds of cultures of enterprise. And focusing here on lower middle classes in India, as in other places as well, and thinking about their own kinds of practices and how they understand their own kinds of economic activities as well. As I say, there's a tendency, I think, to either say people are rejecting this kind of discourse that's being circulated by powerful institutions, and they're rallying against this notion of we should be enterprising subjects. Or there's a tendency to say, oh, look at these young people, they've become avatars for World Bank economists, and they're just sort of absorbing these ideas. I would argue that that's actually not what's happening in this case. What you see is actually these forms of creative appropriation and reinvention that draw on sort of older ideas that certainly predate neoliberalism on ideas like Jugaad, but that they also link together and meld together with these kinds of discourses in ways that might be involved in extending, deepening processes of neoliberalization, which is something that we wouldn't expect given what we know about the sort of empirical data on the sort of how lower middle classes have been affected by neoliberal change. So the importance of thinking about those other cultures of enterprise. A second point is around this idea of, there's a lot of work in geography, sociology, in business around innovation, and thinking about processes of how does innovation happen and what are the networks through which innovations are then passed along and so on. I would argue that improvisation might also be a sort of key word, as it were, for future research on looking at social and economic change. And then lastly, one of the things that we talk about in the Annals paper is around the possibility of thinking comparatively about other terms around improvisation, around getting around the system, around making do. There's terms like jeitinho in Brazil, dubriagem in Guinea-Bissau. There's some really great work by Jeremy Jones on kukia in Zimbabwe, which suggests similar kinds of things to Jugaad in terms of this notion of sort of ducking and diving and finding your way, to sort of improvise a livelihood with whatever you have to hand in that particular moment. At the same time, I think there are also important differences in the sense, certainly, of the sort of portability of Jugaad and the way it's been even adopted by not just sort of upper classes, but even in planning circles as well in India. But I think there's some ground for thinking about those sort of practices around improvisation as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
As always, I'd like people that have to leave their chance to ask the question first. If you can stay on past one and don't raise your hand by yet. If you leave me, I want to ask a question. Then please go for it. Okay, well then it's open.
This runs a lot in the early work done in gang behavior in the United States. You all go back to studies of crime, the initial notion was crime was a result of the breakdown of social norms, and instead the notion we got into the actual study of the subculture was terribly well organized.
Yeah.
And precisely this link between the marginal and the way in which you make it in a very complicated world, which is, in a sense, beyond you to do anything serious about, but if you work right, you can come out pretty well.
Yeah. It was interesting that you did that, Joe, because I was thinking about in that piece on Kakia in Zimbabwe, Jeremy Jones talks about it as this sort of zigzagging path as being, sort of the basis through which these young men in Zimbabwe try to find their way through. And I think that you're right, and certainly there's sort of longer history around, the literature that looks at this kind of thing. I think one of the things that's maybe interesting to think about in this context would be around, one would be a lot of that early work would look at the urban poor, for example. This is slightly different in the sense of sort of lower middle class students being involved as well, which, as I say, we might think about as being related to some of these economic changes that have pressed more people into this kind of work as well. So I think there's an interesting way in which we're seeing different kinds of sectors of society being involved in this kind of work. And the other part of it would have been, as I say in this latter point, the ways in which that term, those notions around hustle and other kinds of terms as well, being adopted, it wouldn't be adopted by the government. And you can't imagine the US government saying what we need is more kind of hustle on as a way to. It's what's interesting about Jugaad is the way, because of the sort of broad range of meanings that it can have, the way it's being picked up in lots of different ways that might be sort of also reinforcing certain kinds of practices as well. But certainly it sort of goes back to those kinds of things as well, those earlier studies. But I think there's some interesting sort of shifts that are happening as well.
Any difference in the tone when Dalits use the word and Jats use the word?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think in terms of how an older generation would use the word and what it would mean to them, there is definitely a difference. But I think in terms of Dalit, I mean, and these are sort of more wealthier, Dalits from wealthier families who use the term, it was often used in meaning the same kind of thing as well. And I think that those kind of practices as discourses had to some extent also sort of filtered through to that population too.
So I'm interested in this critique of Jugaad and popular critiques that you encountered. And when you mentioned the personality centers, that sort of made me think of historic developments in America. And I wonder if this could at all be an interesting source of comparison for you. So the story seems to be that in the early 20th century, you get a shift in, let's say, American popular culture from the admiration of character to the admiration of personality. And character is a much more kind of quiet, introverted, uncelebrated notion of what it is to be a noble human being. Mm. And personality is a much louder, more extroverted kind of ideal where there's a lot of advertisement of the self. So I wonder at all if, so maybe that's just a development in the Western world, maybe there's really nothing like that contrast in your work, but I wondered if you see people criticizing Jugaad from a more, you could say, introverted or perhaps more kind of character based set of ideals.
Mm. That's really interesting, actually. I hadn't really sort of thought about that before, but I think there's definitely some scope for thinking through that. And maybe the kind of thing that you're talking about there makes me think around how people in Delhi, for example, would talk about what was happening in Meerut, and would make that kind of critique as well, and also how sort of more elite or upper caste populations might make a similar critique in terms of that kind of brash sort of bravado that has become a sort of so prevalent amongst these young men who are trying to get ahead and make cash in Meerut. So I think that there probably is something that would be sort of classed, and also a critique that would emerge from thinking about those sort of geographical differences in terms of between major metropolitan areas and a city like Meerut in terms of how people might think about those kinds of shifts that are happening in terms of the sort of personality of the young lower middle class entrepreneur. Does that in any help?
I have two questions. One, what is the role of Bollywood in reinforcing notions of jugaad? And the other question is, you mentioned that jugaad is a very North Indian word. So how is, if at all, how has it been adopted in the South, where Hindi is not majority? Which are there parallel notions that are being equated to it? How is the jugaad discourse being adopted in other places?
Those are two really interesting questions. I would say in terms of Bollywood, I think that there are certain kinds of there are a set of films, as well as also in literature as well, where that have sort of focused on and to some extent celebrated the young urban person who's trying to get ahead and make it on the under very tough circumstances. And I think that's definitely a part of sort of works within these discourses as well, in terms of that focused on the sort of lower middle class youth. So I think that Bollywood feeds into it in that sense, and I do think that part of this sort of way in which these practices and discourses become reinforcing is, I think there's going to be a whole lot of films that are going to, I know there's a film that's now come out called Jugaad. I think there's going to be a whole slew of books and films that will draw more explicitly on this idea as well. And again, going back to the point when I was answering Joe's question, is that that's part of it. Is that it's also cropping up now. There's now business manuals sort of written by Indian entrepreneurs that are also about jugaad, a guide to making building an enterprise in India and stuff like that. So yeah, Bollywood will be one important site for thinking about the production of that kind of idea. In terms of how it's being taken up in the South, that's a really good question. I did ask a friend of mine in South India. I was like, is there a sort of, and I'm sure that there is, but he didn't know that there would be a sort of corollary of this in other South Indian languages. But it would be interesting to think about whether now that the national government is involved, is adopting this term, how that might be taken up, or maybe it would be seen as a sort of more North Indian kind of project, and people maybe in the South would sort of reject that idea. But yeah, I don't know at this point, but it'll be interesting to see now that at the national level it's being promoted, whether it does sort of enter into the lexicon in sort of everyday language in South India.
Stephen, I'd just like to ask a question before you wrap up, and that's about caste. I have so many discussions with people about whether caste is still relevant or not, and those conversations can go any which way depending on kind of their angle. But clearly caste is extremely relevant in terms of these higher caste politicos, as you call them, and then also how they exploit the Dalit population. How does it play out in other aspects of life? I mean, the kind of things that we think of as caste being relevant. How people live and who they hang out with. And do you see it there, or is it really only in the kind of student politics?
No, I think much more broadly, it's still. I mean, in this particular area, in Northwest UP, it's a really important axis of social difference and marker of differences in society and of inequalities. And in those kinds of social spaces that I was pointing to, in the sort of tea stalls and hanging out on the street corners and stuff, you see that as well. But the interesting thing is that, I mean, these are a set of economic transformations that are having impact in terms of young men, as I was saying, in terms of they would want to, like jugaad is this term that means like on one hand I can celebrate it as being, look at me, I've found a way to make it. On the other hand, it does, like people would say, I'm really not, I know this is bad, I know this is wrong, okay? And that they would have preferred to move into sort of, formal government positions and so on. There's a real ambivalence there, but one of the questions that I'm involved in another research project is, why then don't, lower caste and the sort of middle class, but locally quite dominant Jats actually collectively work together to try and say, well, we're all negatively impacted by these things that are happening in terms of the expansion of private colleges. And that there have been moments where that has happened. In 2005, 2007, there were the emergence of student movements which were cutting across these kinds of lines as well. So there are those moments, But as I say, what happened in those instances was those people with the better connections and a better standing and greater influence were able to sort of bring that movement down from within, because they're able to use that to their advantage and you know, sort of make money. And at that particular moment, the chancellor of Georgia Transition University, which is where you need to get your affiliation to open your college, was also a Jat man who, I was told by one of the students, basically one day called all these young Jat politicals into his office and said, "Are you going to do this your whole life? I don't think so, but you could get affiliation here at the university and open your own college," and things like that. So it was really important in terms of how that movement began to fracture, you know, along caste lines as well.
Oh, but John, yes.
I just wanted to, so this is all familiar to me in kind of Greek terms, as far as like you get this word pornografia, which also means, it means cleverness, but it means street smarts. It's also gendered in the same way that the ideal person who has this kind of street smarts is the manga, the like kind of, you know, clever guy on the street, the man's man, and who knows how to get things done by any channel, by any means necessary. And I would say that that's one of the reasons why Greece is in the position where it is right now, because you have this celebration of this kind of street smarts, how to get out of paying your taxes, and well, we do see where that leads.
Yeah.
I wonder about the gender quality of this. Surely women are just as equipped to be hustlers as men are. And we've had talks before that talk about the, you know, the local strong woman just as much as the local strong man.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? Is there, I mean, are there women who, for, you know, all the genderedness of this, you know, this quality, are there female representatives that you come across?
Is biology given this term?
Yeah, for that matter, really.
That's a good question, yeah. I don't know about that particular term. I mean, this is really interesting. You've got to write down those terms for me, by the way, those Greek terms. In terms of young women being involved in this, partly it was because, I mean, part of it, I think, is, as a geographer, I'm always interested in questions around space and mobility, the fact that these kinds of enterprise cultures and these kinds of strategies and practices were emerging out of key public spaces around the city, where it was very difficult in this context for women to be able to spend significant time there. So, you know, these were very much, you know, male-dominated spaces as well, where these kinds of plans were hatched. And then the other part of it, though, is, as you're saying, it's not as though women couldn't play that role, but the way in which they were actively constructed by young men who had become politically influential on that campus as not being capable of doing that role was critical in terms of further marginalising young women from politics on campus. And that was one of the ways that they would sort of construct, you know, there were a few young women who would become involved in politics and try to run for office in student politics themselves. But part of the way, the ways in which they were delegitimized by the male candidates was as someone who, you know, like if you really want someone who can get things done, then, you know, you need someone who's going to be tough and aggressive and, you know, this kind of thing as well. And so, yeah, it's these are sort of socially constructed ways in which women were seen as not being able to practice these kinds of forms of hustle as well, but that nevertheless worked as a powerful check on young women becoming involved in politics, as well as also poorer and lower caste students from being able to become more involved in politics on the campus as well.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. That was, as always, great. And for being here.
Yeah.
So now you know the price you pay for sending in one title.
Exactly.
Becoming attractive to me at the same time.
Well, you know, I always write my titles are always aspirational. And I always submit this title.
Too hard, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and you just think I'll find a way through in the end. But
I have to tell you though that the federal government